Hello and welcome to Schema App Live. Thank you for joining me. My name is Jeffrey Burns. I am a CSM here at Schema App. Today we are going to dig into authoring and deployment. These are two topics that are core to Schema App's enterprise solution. We create and deploy markup for hundreds of websites and millions of web pages. And this is step 2 in a 3-part series. Our first session was on strategy. So if you're not sure what schema strategy you're going to be implementing, then definitely go and check that out. Today, we're going to look at authoring and deployment. Bear with me, I will share my screen and we can go through a quick introduction, an example, and description of how to author your markup and deploy it to your web page. Couple of things to note, just some housekeeping. If you do have questions, please shout them out in the chat. We have some wonderful helpers here today. Lisa, Karen, and Elise will be able to triage or answer your questions. And of course, we'll have a Q&A session at the end where I can just take your questions on and answer them ad hoc. Always nice to know where people are joining us from, so let us know. There's lots of schemers or schema app users from around the world, and we love seeing where you are. Okay, let's jump in. All right, today we are looking at authoring and deployment. This is my knowledge graph. Here we are. We're good now. Again, I'm Jeffrey Burns, huge fan of the Maple Leafs. I went to York University, volunteered with Heart and Stroke, and I work at Schema App. And this is an image of my knowledge graph. Schema App is a full-service enterprise schema solution, and we're trusted by brands the world over. We do like to see where you are, so if you can let us know in the chat, we can all celebrate markup from our different areas in the world. And schema markup is, we like to think a 5-step journey. It starts with strategy, authoring deployment is the next cycle, and then you maintain and learn about the reporting. So what is schema markup? When you're first starting out, you might notice that Google uses the term structured data interchangeably with schema markup. And in this context, they mean the same thing. Speaking more broadly, structured data can mean many things. So we prefer schema markup because it's more specific. So for our purposes, if you hear or read or see these terms, know they're sort of interchangeable, but at the end of the day, it's computer code that you're inserting into your web page that Google and other search engines can understand. And your web page, it probably makes sense to you and every other human who reads it. And while search engines like Google can find and index that content, it may not be clear to the search engine what that content is about. And schema markup bridges that gap. It's a vocabulary that provides clarity to a machine. And there's over 800 schema class types that each have like 20 plus properties that define that thing. And a good example to think about is we would all be schema.org class types person, but our name properties or image properties would be different. So my name would be Jeffrey, yours is your name. And the benefit of providing this additional understanding and context is that Google is better able to match your content with relevant search queries. And they also use structured information you provide them to inform rich results, which are this decorated result in search that entice people to click through. So in summary, schema markup helps drive higher and more relevant traffic to your website. And you don't have to take our word for it. We have a whole bunch of case studies for different industries on our website, so go check that out. There is probably one that's relevant to you. But Google has their own case studies that they share, and they report significant improvements in organic traffic, to time on site, to conversion, and how schema can support your business, the return on investment for yourself. It varies based on what your business is and how your website and organic search rolls up in your customer funnel. But what does it look like? We're talking about authoring schema. So what does schema look like? Well, if you go to schema.org, you'll see the vocabulary, and that's the first place to start. And it's a hierarchy of schema class types that you can see. As you go deeper, they get more specific. So the most generic schema class type is thing. And then at the next branch or level in the hierarchy, it gets more specific. And as you go deeper, it gets more specific. And every single class type describes the type of thing we're marking up. So it's the label. It's kind of the big bucket. It's the first thing you start with when you're looking at a piece of content on your website. So like I said, if we were to create markup for each of us, we would be a person, but our properties like the family name would be different. And another thing to keep in mind is that the schema class type is Pascal case, and all of the properties are camel case. So you can see that a class always starts and every letter is capitalized. Then the properties are camel case where the second and following words are capitalized. So we're going to double click on properties here. Schema properties are defined by values. And this is important to keep in mind because we want to know how to define a value to include in his markup. Okay, so hopefully everybody is able to see my screen. Right now, we would be looking at pictures of schema.org properties. You can see it now. Okay, thank you. It wouldn't be a live conversation if we didn't have to iterate or change things on the spot. So what we're looking at is the schema.org class properties, and we're looking at how to understand the value a property expects and where it's relevant for. This is the connector, or sort of the crux of how you can tie your markup together. So there's three main value inputs for a schema.org property. The first is text. So the family name property would just expect text. The next one is a URL. And this is really powerful. You can reference a web page that is relevant for that property. I'm going to double click on the same as property again later on. And then the third is a class type, which means that the value for this property is best defined by including a schema class, which allows you to further define that thing. So like my birthplace is Barrie, Ontario. Rather than just typing the text Barrie, Ontario, we could use the schema.org class place and actually say, this was a hospital on a street in Barrie in Ontario in Canada. So the schema.org place allows you to provide that further context. So just to get started, there's a structured data format. This is the actual code that is included. There's three formats that Google accepts. There's the JSON-LD format. It's recommended. That is what Schema app produces. I recommend also that you go with JSON-LD. It seems to make things easier. As you can see, it's not interleaved and it's visible to the user in one block, so that's nice. Microdata was the preferred format maybe 4 years ago. It's still relevant. You'll find it within a lot of common themes in WordPress and so on. And then RDFA is also still valid, although lesser used. When we were talking about these properties, they're the opportunity for you to nest your schema objects. And nesting, it provides clarity. So when you nest a place schema under the birthplace property, it makes it really clear that this is not just a place we're talking about, but specifically in the context of where I was born, just to follow that example. And so if we have, let's say, all of these schema types within our page, it's not clear what is the primary entity or what's important. Are we potentially talking about an event, a single family residence? Are we talking about an image? But if we nest them, like so, we can see that this image is relevant for this product and single family residence. This postal address is relevant or is the postal address for our residence and product. It has an offer. It has an attached to our offer is an agent who you could contact. And of course, we might have an event like a showing. So this is to underline the fact that nesting provides the clarity and implies the relationship between items. This is the image of our single family residence. This is the offer and the real estate agent for the single family residence, and the nesting and placement of those objects implies that context. I mentioned I would touch on the same as property again, and I want to do that, but when we're talking about @IDs. This is really important. So, and if you get this, it's sort of the crux of all of it. So if you've built your markup, you've created a graph. And @IDs are identifiers for the nodes or the pieces in your markup, and it allows them to be referenceable across pages. So you don't end up with islands of markup with no context past that page. It really is the key here. So the example, just to actually show you what it would look like, you have the @ID keyword here and a URL value or a string here. And every time you go and reference that, it would be indexable as well. So you don't end up with an island, you actually end up with this connected graph across pages. And this is a concept that's comes from linked data, and it's an IRI or a URI, and it's a fundamental concept. For nodes to be truly linked, the identifier has to be represented in the node through the @ID. A way to show you this in Schema itself, if we take a look at an article, how would you tie the article to the author across pages? So if we look, the author has an @ID keyword here. We've defined it with the URL for Karen. And when we go look at the schema for that, for her profile page, we can see that it matches. And so as Google goes through and crawls and indexes your markup on each page, you can tie these nodes together through the @ID. It's a really core concept here, because if you have a node without an @ID, it can't be used past that page. It provides context in one place and it's less useful. So it avoids islands of schema. Every object should have an @ID. It may not be included in the full index graph if you don't do that. And it's a good thing that if you're using Schema app, you can forget this, because we automate the @IDs for every Schema object for you automatically. And all of your markup will be connected across your site without you having to think about it. Now, the final tricky piece that we're going to cover before looking at an actual example is linked entities. And this is where that schema property can be defined by a URL. So entities have become stronger than keywords these days, and linking to authoritative descriptors on concepts or things in your content is a better SEO strategy now than like keyword stuffing. Um, and so we can link to authoritative websites. The function's available for anything, but you want to use these vocabularies or websites that have authority themselves. So Wikipedia, Wikidata, DBpedia, Google's knowledge graph identifiers, all themselves, you want to use those. And the way to do it, what it actually looks like, is to use the same as property for the schema object you're working on and link to the actual URL that talks about the type of thing that you're calling out. So our example here would be in the content for a product of a miter saw, and the schema would look like this. It would be a product with the name of miter saw, a brand for DeWalt, and then for same as, literally just the URLs that are relevant for the content or for that schema object. Okay. Now you know what schema class types are, you know what properties are, you know how to recognize what values a property are expecting, if that's a text, URL, or another schema object, and you know that you want to have your @IDs, and you're ready to go, and you're wondering, hey, how do I know what schema classes to how can I connect my schema classes. So we have our Schema Paths tool, and let's say you want to connect an offer to your product. So you can start with your product class and choose your offer class is where you want to connect to, and it'll show you all the possible paths, either directly or inverse. And so for us, we can see that product has an offers property, which is, and we can tell it's a property by its camel case that connects to the offer, which is Pascal case. So in Schema app, you would create your product entity. You would go to the offers property, create your offer data item, and now you can add your price. So in the editor, how this actually works with Schema app is you're going to create data items. You'll hear us talk about data items throughout much of our content, and a data item is a actual real manifestation of a schema class type. It's a real instance that you're creating, and to create it, you need to give it a label, a place to go, and a class type. So there's two steps here. The first one is labeling it, where you name it, provide a URI. This will inform the @ID. It'll also tell Schema app where it's going to deploy to, like what web page specifically. And then verify that we're using the correct class type. Next, we're going to describe the data item by filling out those properties. So in Schema app, it'll look like this. Call it something that makes sense, give it a URL, and make sure the type is correct. And then when it loads, you have your form builder, and you can actually fill these out. So if you were following along, you would know that in our schema strategy session, we talked about Guelph Storm. So I'm going to do a quick example here for Guelph Storm to underline how this actually works in Schema. This was our strategy, and I've created markup for the home page, but what if we wanted to create markup for one of their articles? So I'll go to Schema app, and we're live in the tool right now. And here's the page I want to create markup for. It's an article on Guelph Storm's website. So I'm going to look for the schema class that's relevant for my content. I start with thing and go through the class tree, creative work, article. Select that class and create a data item. And we need our three things. So I need the URL for our data item, and I need the name, which in this case, this is the headline of our article, and I'll create. Now our form builder shows us the required and recommended fields. We did talk about the required or recommended properties when we went through our strategy. So if you need to know where these are from, Google has documentation on what properties they expect. And then our class types here are called out for the values for the properties. So we'll say Charlie is our author, they're a person, create. The date it was published, here we are, June 17th, 2021. So June 17th. We have our headline. Need an image, copy the image address. Image, create a data item. It needs to be an image object. We'll create, and it needs the image address. Done. And the publisher, we've already created a data item for Guelph Storm, and Schema app lets you reuse data items when they're relevant. So we'll say that Guelph Storm is the publisher of this content. We'll click done. And this is what your schema actually looks like. So for each of the types, the content's just taken from your input into the form builder, and you can see that Schema app automatically does the @ID for your objects. All right, deployment with Schema app. So we are now in the deployment stage of your markup journey. I recommend testing your deployment initially so that you're confident when authoring markup that it's deploying. We have automatic deployment at Schema app. So we have a number of tools that create markup. We store that generally in our Schema Markup Graph database. We have one exception where markup is built as the page loads. Our Schema Delivery Network brings the markup into your page either through JavaScript in the page itself or a tag manager deploying the markup. And we have cached options for plugins, custom APIs, and also JavaScript with caching. So the editor deployments, which is our most common authoring tool, is our plugins, tags, and custom integrations. Our plugins are for many of the most popular content management systems. We have WordPress, we have Shopify, BigCommerce, and Drupal. Our deployment options are also for JavaScript and tag managers. So if you want to implement the JavaScript just in the page itself or use a manager, you can have that as well. Highlighter deployments, we have two main ways of doing this. One is with JavaScript again, and the other is through a crawler, which builds markup and then can be deployed through any of those integration options that we just highlighted. Rob, I see, can I use your schema with Webflow UX? Schema app hasn't found a website yet that we can't optimize. Whether that's through an integration or just with the JavaScript, you can implement pretty much anywhere. So a couple of things to keep in mind for your deployment. One is you can use JavaScript to deploy things automatically. So this is a really wonderful option because you avoid having to deal with integrating into a content management system. It's uniform for every case because it's just the JavaScript that's firing. A couple of best practices, though, is that this needs to fully execute in 3.5 or under 4 seconds in order for Google to actually index the markup. Google didn't have documentation for JavaScript for a long time, and they do now. It came out maybe 6 months ago, and the whole crux of this is that it needs to execute within 3.5 seconds to under 4 seconds in order for it to be found. You can use server-side rendering. You just need to make sure that your JSON LD block is in the rendered output for the page. This is a really great option. If you can have it server side, it's kind of ideal because you lose any of the complications of injecting your markup into the page itself. The only challenge then is if you're not using a common type like article or product that has a widget or a plugin automatically creating markup for the page, you need to have a solution that will refresh your markup or capture markup for each page and have it built so that when it's rendered in the rendered output, it's relevant. Sort of the hard part for server side. That's where our highlighter has the crawler option. You can deploy your highlighter to template anything you need at all, builds that markup, and then shares it server side through a plugin. There's also an API that can notify Google of changes to your schema markup. This is really cool. It can help in cases where you have issues with indexing pages that are new to your sitemap. This is available for 2 rich results today. That is your job postings, which may go up and down quickly, and for your videos, again, which may go up and down quickly. So this is automated in Schema app as well. You just have to enable that feature. Finally, you need to test your implementation. So you need to know, is the markup deploying and is it looking correct? So if we go back to Schema app, you can do this automatically where we can test with the rich results test. One thing to note, the rich results test only judges pages based on rich result eligibility. It does not capture any schema objects that don't have a rich result. If you need to test a page and see the full spectrum of your markup, you would instead use the schema validator on schema.org. Some resources for you. We have our website footer. So check out our website. We're constantly building training, videos, articles, and content to help you. So check out our resources and recent blogs. Definitely send us a ticket if you're a Schema app user and need some help, or just check out our customer support and training tutorials. We also have a knowledge base. This is where the CSM team will pull together common tickets and create content so that you're able to find an issue and overcome that on your own. And then the Schema Paths tool is actually on our website as well. So if you're stuck and not sure where to nest your schema markup, come here and use the Schema Paths tool. It's also live in Schema app itself. And be sure to sign up for our newsletter. We're constantly sharing information that's relevant to the state of Schema today. And that's also where you would be able to get notifications for part 3, maintenance and monitoring and analytics on your markup. Thank you. I'm absolutely happy to answer some live questions. Type them into chats and we can talk through any trouble you're having, questions about authoring with Schema app, or questions around troubleshooting your own deployment. We can even talk through some options or schema strategy for your potential use case. So let us know what your questions are and we can go through it. So from Schema, for deployment, we use our WordPress plugin. Do we need to do anything else? Good question, Seema. So our WordPress plugin is really great. It automates markup, and it's also free. So it's wonderful, honestly. I love sharing that because it's just immediate value. But it only automates markup for your posts and your pages from the creative work section of schema.org. So it'll do articles and blog posting schema for you. Which is great, but if you need to create custom markup for your homepage, which you should, or for your products, or for your solution pages, or your schema, just it needs to be optimized beyond just check marking that there's some schema in your page, you would want to sign up for Schema app and use either our editor or our highlighter, because that's where you can have custom schema. And they play together nicely. So any of the markup that you create with our editor or with our highlighter tool will replace or merge nicely with anything that's automated through either our WordPress plugin or BigCommerce or Shopify apps. And of course, just deployed natively through JavaScript if that's how you're set up. Okay, Jason. Previously, Google recommended against using Tag Manager to implement schema. Just checking, we're okay to use Tag Manager. Yes, absolutely, you are okay to use Tag Manager. I'm not sure if Google recommended against using Tag Manager or if they were kind of just quiet on the subject. We used Tag Manager, or really JavaScript and Tag Manager, to implement it this whole time. It's just around making sure that it's calling in all of your objects. It's not, including partial schema, and that the whole thing's executing fast enough for Google to index. They also have an option to capture dynamic values using Tag Manager. That's a little more complex to set up. But with Schema app, we have an integrations page. Just copy and paste the schema code that's relevant for your project, and then you're done. You just publish that to every page and you're ready to go. The only challenge is when you have really bad page speed and it can't execute fast enough. But if that's happening, you might have some other work to do as well. Hi, this is from Lillian. I was wondering what the current status of the highlighter is. I know we're working on it to be more flexible with content that doesn't fall into a container format or each post. Are there any updates? There's sort of two things there. So one, we are currently working on our highlighter version 2. That's going to be a Chrome extension. I'm really excited about that because it'll work natively with the content in the page. Right now, we have to use headless Chrome to pull in your page, and there's potential for some of the content to not perfectly align. And when we're using XPaths or advanced functions, it can be difficult or harder to troubleshoot. The new highlighter Chrome extension is also coming with a more friendly user interface so that the workflow can be a little bit more optimized with fewer clicks. So I'm really excited for that. I'm only teasing it though. It's not ready today, but our team is working on it, every day. And then also there was an advanced function where we could create a templated schema for a list of things and then account for certain variables that aren't always perfectly in the list. That enhancement is available today. Right now, there isn't an interface for it. It has to be implemented by a CSM in our back end, but it's possible, it's working, and we're really excited about that. How you can account for unstructured content in a templated highlight is Some of the wizardry that the Schema app devs have implemented, I'm not actually sure how it worked. It seems like magic to me, but it's available today. From Abby, I have a question about finding the image object to upload in compliance with Google. Yeah, great question. So, I mean, first is that you don't want to copy the image. I've made that mistake. You need to copy the image address, and this is an indexable image address. Google has certain image formats that it must be. So it must be a .jpeg, .gif, .svg is allowed now, or .png. So if you have those file formats, you're good to go. And then images are used in a number of places. So you could have an image of a product, you could have an image for a logo, you could have an image for the logo of a publisher of articles, and the dimensions, height and width of your image changes based on those. For products, I believe it's almost any image is acceptable. Then for your logo of your organization, you want it to be, I think, 86 by 86 height and width. And then for the publisher, it needs to be, I think, 36 by 115. It's sort of a flat rectangle. All of those dimensions and requirements are in Google's documentation for the article rich results, or for your product, or for your logo rich results. And they're also, all of that logic is captured in Schema app. So if you create your markup in the editor, there will be guidance on where you're creating that image markup. Jason, I have a physician. I want a page about the person. However, I see person is a clinic. What would I use to define physician as a distinct from his clinic? Yeah, very interesting, actually, that physician, we might hear the word physician and think of the person, but for search and for user search intent, more commonly, they're looking for, the practice of that physician, the business case of that physician. So physician is a more specific class type of local business, and it expects all of the information you would expect from a normal business. So it would need an address, it would need a logo, you can call it the services that are provided. If you want, you have a couple of options. You could multi-type that, and that's where your schema object has two class type properties in the same section of your JSON-LD schema. And you could say it's a person and a physician. Or another one, if let's say you have a practice or a physician where there's multiple, you can say that there's an employee who's a person. So this is another example of where you might want to use the Schema Paths tool. So you would say, hey, I have a physician schema class and I have a person schema class. How do I connect these two things? What property do I use? And it would list and it would show you that employee is a property that expects the person type, and that's where you can nest it. Again, a great opportunity to call out @ IDs. So as you're building out that person schema, if this doctor has like a physician page on the company website, then you'd be able to tie those two things together. And that's actually really powerful for topics that are like healthcare or anywhere there's like industry expertise. Definitely have a page that talks about the person, lists, even where they went to school, different papers they've submitted, or things that make them an expert on their profile page. Call those out in the schema, and everywhere that person is referenced, if you have the @ ID, that sort of authority follows it. And that's how you can borrow authority for topics from different sections of your website or across the web. Thanks for the webinar. You're welcome. Will you send out an email when we publish this? Yeah, of course. We'll let everybody know. Shelly, how do we test the schema is being indexed when using Tag Manager to deploy it? If schema doesn't have rich results. So a couple of questions there. Great questions. So first of all, the rich results test won't show you your markup if you're not using schema types that are eligible for rich results. So that's when you would want to use the schema.org validator, because it shows you all of the class types. And if it's finding the markup when you test the URL, then you know that it's in the page. And then just to your first part, how do you know it's being indexed? You can, in Search Console, and inspect the URL, and it'll show you what rich results that page is eligible for. You're only eligible if you have the markup, so that's how you can know. The greater question of how do I know the impact of my markup that's not eligible for rich results is something that we're going to touch on in our next iteration of Schema Live, where we look at maintenance, monitoring, reporting, and insights. That's a harder question to answer, but in Search Console, there are enhancement reports and search appearance filters that show you the impact of the different rich results you're achieving across all of your pages. Okay, does every element require an @ID? Jason, so I would say every element requires an @ID. If it's a schema object, you've said that this content on this web page is important enough that I want Google to understand it, it should have an @ID. And actually, if you look at the functions of nodes in a schema graph through like the documentation on linked data, uh, if you don't have an @ID, that sort of blank node is dropped off and isn't indexable or usable across the graph from another area. So basically, if you want Google to understand one of your schema objects from beyond just the page it exists on, you need to have an @ID that's referenceable. Um, so yeah, I would say everything, wherever you can. And Schema App does it automatically. If you create a schema object using Schema App, we automatically make it have an @ID. Okay, Cheryl, you mentioned indexable for ID where a URL is listed. If the URL is blocked to robots, I'm assuming this would be an issue. Scenario, author of articles is listed in WordPress rather than the organization. Yeah, if you're creating markup for a page that is not indexable, then it's, that consumer of your structured data, Google, is going to miss it. That can be done strategically. I've seen cases where um, the customer funnel is stronger through resource or information pages that link to products rather than products being their own landing page. I know that would sound funny where you don't want the landing page itself to be the first thing that shows up. But this was a sort of a niche product where that just actually through testing had a higher click-through and conversion. So, we would still include the markup for those pages to provide context to the support resource articles and information to say, hey, all of this is about this topic, and then have that rank for those queries. But the page itself wasn't indexed or had like a no follow, no index. So yes, I would be careful. For me, I would say generally you want everything that's relevant to your customer funnel or to show up in organic search, and don't block those pages. But if you do block them, yeah, also blocks your markup. Just going through, taking a look. If you have any questions, now's your opportunity to shout it out. I might also tell you that if you're using any of our tools, they all do play nicely together. So one thing that you can keep in mind is if you have your WordPress plugin that's creating markup for your blog, and then you have a highlighter for all your 1,000 solution pages, then your editor items for just the core company pages like your organization, all of those merge nicely through Schema App. All that work that you would have to get creative with your JSON curly brackets and build by yourself by hand, that's taken care of. And then something to keep in mind also is that recently Google changed how they approach multiple items on the same page. So before, maybe like even like Q4 of last year was this, where you wouldn't want to have conflicting top level entities. So you wouldn't want article, product, video, all to be conflicting types that aren't nested some way on your page. But now Google's documentation has changed to say, no, it's okay to have these different groups of schema objects. You might want to use the main entity of page property in your article, for example, to say this is the most important one, or use the @IDs to actually call in and nest those when it's pulled together by Google across pages or on that page. But you can have the same page be eligible for different rich results based on different sections of the content. And I know that there's a lot of pages out there that are sort of a collection page of competing important pieces of content that may not serve the exact same purpose. And there's now room for that in Google's documentation, where you could say have a solutions page or a help page where you have a how-to section and you have an FAQ section. You can mark them up separately, and then based on the query, Google can use whichever rich result is best for the searcher. Abby, I'm really struggling with this images stuff on my Squarespace site. My question may be more specific. Send us an email. We're always happy to help. Image stuff, it can be a little tricky, but it's also once you set it up, it's done. Cheryl, when you're multi-typing, are they grouped as a collection page or are they independent items? So when you're multi-typing a data item, it would have it's a single item of two types. If you have multiple items on a page, then it could be both. It could be a high, like a top-level entity that's fully separate in this instance, but it could also be connected to the same graph later on. So if you want to think about it this way, you could have that how-to section, you could have that FAQ section. None of those properties directly point at each other, but they could both point to the organization as the publisher of that content. So when the whole graph is indexed, Google knows that these two pieces are from the same place, but they don't connect directly. So that's how you can take advantage of that, but have everything actually connected. Okay. I think that's all. We might have time for one more if you get it out quickly. Otherwise, we might call that schema authoring and deployment. All right, well, I just want to say thank you so much. I always enjoy these. If you have any questions around schema authoring or deployments, you can shout out to us. If you have a big schema project you want, or project and you want to know how schema can help deliver higher value for your customers, reach out to us and we can talk through your strategy. We'll have a recording sent out for this later. Please go and subscribe to our next iteration where we'll talk about measuring the health, the value, and the return and analytics of your schema markup. Thanks so much. Take care.